In stories, we often mistake building a world for telling one. Many praise stories simply because they have dense lore or feel alive, assuming that rich cultures and sprawling timelines automatically improves the world building. Over time, that idea has been stretched so thin that world building no longer refers to what it actually means. The term is so diluted that a pretty background shot or a building can be called world building, regardless of its role. But here's the truth. Almost everything you've been told about world building misses the point. A story isn't better because it has dozens of named locations or avoids familiar tropes. What matters is how the story uses its world, what those elements justify, what they reframe, and what meaning they create. That's it. So, let's break that down and explain why most world-building praise gets everything wrong. But before we go any further, let's establish a baseline. Which image has better world building? Picture A, the Mad Tea Party from Alice in Wonderland. Picture B, a background shot from Delicious in Dungeon. One story is openly nonsensical, whereas in Dungeon Meshi, everything appears carefully structured. You can pause and speculate about the choice. But that's exactly the problem. If you try to answer the question at all, the mistake isn't which image you chose, it's the question itself. Asking which picture has better world building assumes that meaning comes from what we can infer from a single image, rather than from how or why a story actually uses that setting. You can't meaningfully determine it from this kind of evidence. Stories can and should guide inference. But when any interpretation is valid, because nothing in the narrative constrains, tests, or applies it, that inference tells us very little about the writing. You can infer almost anything from a picture, the same way a Rorschach test invites endless interpretations. That's why the common "it feels alive" praise is functionally empty. It tells us nothing about the story's aim or how its details are actually used. What may feel alive in something like Wonderland would be different in an apocalypse like Girl's Last Tour. Meaningful inference doesn't come from what an image allows you to imagine, but from what the story actively does with those ideas. Now, it's important to define world building because the term has become a buzzword in writing circles and the anime community. World building is commonly defined as the process of constructing a fictional world, often with its own rules, history, and culture. The word process matters. It demonstrates the world building is something the writer does behind the scenes, not something the audience directly experiences. The audience doesn't see the act, they only see the story that results from it. World building is one way a writer creates a constraint system that keeps the story honest. It answers questions like, what's possible here? What's costly? What's normal? What would break credibility if it happened? And that matters because it protects cause and effect. If a story can invent new rules whenever it wants, tension collapses. Not because realism is required, but because consequences stop being legible. But here's the important part. You don't actually need to world build to do this. Internal consistency can be maintained simply by testing the implications of what you've already introduced. Every time you show an ability, a rule, a relationship, or a limitation, you're implicitly asking a question. If this is true, what must also be true? What can't be true anymore? Answering those questions doesn't require maps, timelines, or lore documents. It just requires following your own implications. World building in that sense is a process some writers use to externalize those answers, but the consistency itself comes from discipline, not from detail. Which is why more world building is such a useless critique. What stories actually need is not information, but clear constraints that are tested and respected. When that happens, pressure emerges naturally, setups become meaningful, payoffs land. The world doesn't feel alive because it's big, it feels alive because it pushes back. World building is not the end product. It exists to support the story, not to stand on its own. You're not sitting behind the author watching them draw maps, write monster taxonomies, or debate how many moons the planet should have. But that's what people are implicitly praising when they say a story has good world building.
Hey! Clap one more time, you're not coming to my birthday. Who did that? Giggity.
It's like praising a boxer's training routine just by watching their fights, ignoring that they might be fighting weaker opposition, relying on natural talent, or winning despite imperfect preparation. That's where we get the second, more casual definition that fans tend to imply. For them, world building often just means the amount of clarity of details. The more detail there is, the better. But here's the problem. World-building praise fails when it treats details as inherently valuable, instead of asking what role they play in shaping how the audience or characters understand the story. Without framing and context, details don't deepen a world, they just sit there. What would be praised is how elements come together to reframe our understanding, not the fact that someone can make an extensive wiki page. The obsession with random details has bred an entire genre of world-building videos, in which people find whatever new idea and explain how it will change their world building. That's just new toy syndrome. Now let's look at a show that's often praised for its world building and see whether that praise is actually justified. Delicious in Dungeon is a standout example. People frequently point to its extensive lore, and to Laios' nearly encyclopedic knowledge of monsters as evidence of strong world building. In episode 3, Laios explains how he got his sword, which leads to an explanation of living armor. During this discussion, Laios wonders whether living armor could be eaten.
I wonder what they taste like.
Naturally, the rest of the party and the audience assume the answer is no. You can't eat metal.
What? You can't eat armor?
Later, however, we learn that living armor isn't really supernatural. It's inhabited by a creature similar to a shellfish, meaning it can be eaten. What makes this episode work isn't the amount of detail or the novelty of the idea. It works because the information's framed around problem solving and curiosity. Parts of Laios' sword falling off organically led into a discussion of living armor, which in turn frames the audience's assumptions. And the assumption is tested when Laios faces living armor while his friends are on the brink of losing. We're positioned to believe that eating living armor is impossible, only for that belief to be overturned in a way that solves the issues the story raises. That isn't world building, it's storytelling. A payoff arises from a clear setup, and it works because the story intentionally frames us to expect the opposite outcome. We assume a mage must be controlling the armor, so when the truth is revealed, it meaningly recontextualizes what we thought. Now, simply chalking this up to world building makes it a vague term. No one even knows what it means, since it now captures something too broad. Other techniques make this episode work, but it's not simply the details, it was simply the writing. Because Delicious in Dungeon is framed as a person versus nature story, it must clearly establish the nature of its obstacles. Understanding monsters, environments, and survival mechanics isn't decorative. It's necessary for traits to drive meaningful outcomes. But that same expectation doesn't apply universally. A story like Death Note isn't about overcoming nature, so it doesn't need to build out its world in that way. The conflict operates in shades of person versus person and person versus system. The environment of modern Japan is intentionally stable. It isn't an obstacle and rarely matters beyond providing a familiar baseline. If the world itself isn't the problem, then extensively detailing it would add very little. What people often call world building here is actually the mechanics of the Death Note. The story carefully establishes rules and constraints, then builds conflict through how characters navigate them. When Light needs Naomi Masora's name, the tension doesn't come from the setting, but from the notebook's rules and Light's ability to problem solve within them. That's what gives the action meaning and consequence. This functions in a similar way to Laios learning the truth about living armor. In both cases, understanding the system enables the character to overcome the immediate problem. The difference isn't in the mechanism, but in what the story chooses to center. Psychological manipulation in one case, material reality in the other. Details themselves aren't a problem. Stories that lean heavily into detail can work on a different level, such as helping the audience understand how an unfamiliar world functions. But a lack of detail can work just as effectively. Serial Experiments Lane is deliberately cryptic. Information's withheld, leaving the audience to piece together the story, often without clear answers. It's difficult to tell what's real and what isn't, and that confusion is intentional. Rather than explaining its world, the show builds its atmosphere through long establishing shots, strange visuals, silence, and empty spaces. This is where the term world building starts to break down. When we start calling all of this world building, we end up mixing two very different things: process and presentation. World building is the process by which a writer constructs a background for the story. Presentation, on the other hand, includes everything the audience actually experiences: directing, music, or visuals. When those elements get lumped together, the term stops being useful. In the end, people don't actually love details. They love how it's presented. And once we start praising the wrong thing, or turning a single word into an umbrella term for everything writing related, we lose any real clarity about what's being discussed, let alone what's being done well. Take Alice in Wonderland. The story makes no sense under strict logic, and it isn't trying to. The details don't exist to build a convincing or coherent world that feels alive. They work because the story is framed a particular way. Alice wants to escape, only to discover that a world without meaning or structure is exhausting and unsettling. The details serve that idea, not in spite of it. And that's the point. Meaning doesn't come from piling on information or extracting vague praise from how much there is to look at. It comes from how conditions shape behavior and how characters are forced to act within them. When we praise stories simply for having more lore, more places, more names, we stop talking about storytelling altogether.